Charlotte Sterling never imagined a $599 receipt could destroy the launch of her $200 million jet. In front of investors, she hurled the paper at his chest, telling Mason Carter, an oil-stained single father with a worn toolbox, that he was not worth that much. Mason said nothing in anger. He glanced past her shoulder at the aircraft behind her, then answered that if that were true, her jet was already finished. 1 minute later, the engine fell silent, the panel flared red, and the airfield understood she had insulted the wrong man. If you have ever been underestimated by someone with power, stay close, because Mason is about to prove his worth. The private airfield belonging to Sterling Aero gleamed under a wide morning sky, its tarmac polished until it looked like dark glass, its hangar doors pulled open to reveal a jet that had taken 3 years and a fortune to build. Charlotte Sterling stood near the podium in a tailored ivory suit, rehearsing the words she would use to introduce the aircraft to the room full of investors, journalists, and quietly powerful guests who had flown in just to witness this single moment. The jet behind her was not simply a machine. It was the heartbeat of her company, the project that would either secure a contract worth more money than most people could imagine, or collapse the confidence investors had placed in her for years. Logan Pierce moved beside her, smoothing his jacket, smiling the practiced smile of a man who measured his worth by how close he stood to power. Cameras were already being positioned along the runway, and somewhere near the back, caterers arranged trays of food that cost more per plate than most of the technicians working that morning would earn in a week. Mason Carter arrived through a side gate near the maintenance bay, dressed in a faded jacket with a small tear at the elbow, his hands still carrying the faint smell of grease despite his attempt to wash them clean. He carried an old toolbox that had been passed down to him, its corners worn smooth from years of use, and he walked with the quiet, unhurried steadiness of someone who had spent his life solving problems no one else noticed until they became disasters. He had been called in 2 nights earlier for a minor but important repair to a secondary control relay, the kind of work most people overlooked because it never appeared in glossy photographs. He had finished the job efficiently, tested it twice, and left behind a short written note flagging something else that concerned him, something far more serious than what he had been hired to fix. The cost for his labor came to $599, a modest invoice for hours of precise, careful work that required more expertise than anyone in that gleaming crowd understood. He had no interest in attention that morning, no desire to be seen among people dressed for magazine covers. He simply wanted to submit his invoice and return home to his daughter before the school day ended. The relay he had repaired sat buried deep inside a panel most people never opened, a small component easily overlooked yet critical to keeping the entire startup sequence stable under pressure. He had learned long ago that the parts no one praised were usually the ones that mattered most when something finally went wrong, and he never expected anyone watching that morning to understand the difference. As Mason crossed toward the administrative trailer to hand in his paperwork, Logan noticed him first and made a small, amused sound under his breath, the kind reserved for people he considered beneath his attention. The contrast between the 2 men could not have been sharper that morning, one in a suit worth more than a month of rent, the other in clothes that told the story of actual work. Charlotte glanced over only briefly, her eyes sweeping across Mason the way someone scans a stranger blocking a photograph they are trying to take. She did not ask what he had repaired. She did not consider, even for a moment, that the man she barely looked at twice was the reason the very engine behind her had any chance of running safely that day. To her, he was simply out of place, a smear of grease against the polished image she had spent months constructing for this single launch. Mason reached the payment window just as Logan intercepted him, snatching the invoice before the clerk could take it, his expression already arranging itself into mock outrage. He read the number aloud, exaggerating each syllable, and announced to anyone nearby that a man could apparently charge nearly $600 for what looked like a few minutes of tightening bolts. A small cluster of guests turned to watch, drawn by the theater of it, and a few junior engineers standing close enough to understand the truth lowered their eyes instead of speaking up. They knew exactly what Mason had repaired. They also knew that correcting Logan in front of investors was not a risk worth taking for a stranger in a worn jacket. Charlotte, hearing the commotion, walked over with the brisk authority of someone used to controlling every room she entered, eager to end anything that might distract from her launch. She took the invoice from Logan's hand and studied it for only a second before her mouth curved into something between disbelief and contempt. The number meant nothing to her in terms of actual value. It meant everything in terms of the image she refused to let crack in front of cameras. She lifted her eyes to Mason, taking in his stained sleeves and unremarkable appearance, and decided in that instant that he represented exactly the kind of carelessness she could not afford to be associated with that day. Without lowering her voice, she told him plainly that he was not worth $599, the words landing with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once had to fight for anything she owned. A hush spread through the nearby crowd, the kind of silence that follows when people sense someone has crossed a line yet none of them said a word. Mason did not flinch. He simply held her gaze, his expression unreadable, the calm of a man who had been underestimated so many times before that the insult barely had room to land. Charlotte mistook his stillness for indifference, and emboldened by what she believed was victory, she crumpled the receipt and threw it against his chest. Mason watched it fall to the ground near his boots, then lifted his eyes toward the jet gleaming behind her, his attention catching on something he had noticed 2 nights earlier and never been given the proper chance to report. Whatever he saw in that instant did not stay hidden behind his calm expression for long. He told her, without anger, without raising his voice, that if she truly believed he was not worth what she owed him, then the jet behind her was already finished. Charlotte heard it as a threat, a clumsy attempt at intimidation from a man she had just publicly humiliated, and her temper flared instantly into something sharper. She ordered security to escort him off the property immediately, gesturing toward the gate as though waving away an insect rather than a person. Mason did not argue. He bent down, picked up the crumpled receipt, and as 2 security guards approached, he turned briefly toward Wyatt Cole, the head technician standing near the hangar entrance, and told him quietly to recheck the startup control assembly before anyone attempted ignition. Wyatt's face shifted with the unmistakable look of a man who already feared what that warning meant. Charlotte returned to the podium with the composure of someone who had practiced smiling through pressure for years, and she introduced the jet to the crowd as the future of private aviation, a machine built to redefine what speed, safety, and luxury could mean together. Applause rippled through the audience as the pilot climbed into the cockpit, and cameras turned toward the runway with the eager hunger of people waiting to capture history. The pilot ran through his checklist with practiced calm, flipped the ignition sequence, and for one brief moment the engine hummed to life exactly as it should. Then, without warning, the hum collapsed into silence, and the lights along the control panel blinked once before settling into a steady, furious red. A murmur spread through the crowd immediately, investors leaning toward one another, journalists lifting their phones higher, sensing that something far more interesting than a routine launch was unfolding in front of them. Charlotte kept her smile fixed in place, raising a hand to reassure everyone that this was simply a minor delay, nothing more than a small technical adjustment. Behind that smile, however, her mind raced through every possible explanation, none of which she was prepared to say out loud in front of cameras already capturing every flicker of doubt crossing her face. The investors closest to the stage exchanged glances that needed no translation, the universal language of people quietly recalculating how much confidence they still had in an investment they had nearly finalized. She nodded toward the pilot to attempt the sequence again, her confidence still intact, certain that whatever glitch had occurred would resolve itself the way technical issues sometimes did under pressure. The engine answered with a violent shudder this time, a deep mechanical groan that echoed across the tarmac before falling completely still. Wyatt, standing near the maintenance terminal, watched the diagnostic readout sweep past and felt his stomach drop as he recognized the exact failure pattern Mason had warned him about only minutes earlier. Logan, sensing the danger to his own position, immediately began constructing a narrative far simpler than the truth, declaring loudly enough for nearby officials to hear that the man who had just been removed from the property must have sabotaged the aircraft out of spite. Several heads turned toward the gate where Mason had been escorted only minutes before, the suggestion taking root with frightening speed among people eager for an explanation that did not implicate themselves. Charlotte's expression shifted from polished confidence to something closer to panic as she realized her flagship aircraft, the symbol of everything she had built, was failing in front of the very people whose money she needed most. By the time security reached the outer gate, Mason had nearly crossed into the parking area, his toolbox in hand, his expression calm despite the commotion behind him. Charlotte's voice carried across the tarmac as she called for him to stop, abandoning her pride for just long enough to admit, silently, that she needed him more than she had been willing to acknowledge moments earlier. Mason turned slowly, studying her for a moment before walking back toward the hangar without rushing, without satisfaction, simply responding to a problem the way he always had throughout his life. When he reached her, he did not gloat or remind her of what she had said only minutes before. He told her plainly that the jet had not failed because he walked away. It had failed because no one had been willing to listen when it mattered, and now the consequences had arrived in front of everyone she most wanted to impress. Logan pressed his advantage quickly, insisting to Charlotte and the small circle of executives gathering near the hangar that Mason should be detained until the malfunction could be properly investigated. Charlotte, still rattled and desperate for an explanation that did not point toward her own judgment, allowed herself to consider the possibility that Mason had deliberately created the failure as leverage to force payment. Mason listened to the accusation without raising his voice, then explained plainly that he had only repaired the specific relay he was hired to fix, and that the deeper issue causing the shutdown belonged to an entirely different system, one tied to thermal pressure synchronization deep within the engine housing. Two younger engineers attempted to pull up the diagnostic data on a nearby tablet, paging through readouts filled with unfamiliar codes, clearly uncertain how to interpret what they were looking at. Mason stepped closer, pointed to 3 specific irregularities in the data stream, and explained each one with the precision of someone who had spent years studying exactly this kind of failure pattern long before most of these engineers had finished school. Logan scoffed loudly, reminding everyone within earshot that a man hired for occasional repair work could not possibly understand more than an entire engineering department employed at considerable expense. His tone carried the practiced disdain of someone who needed others to remain small in order to feel large himself. Before the tension could escalate further, Evelyn Grant arrived from the administrative building, her expression sharp with the focus of someone who had spent years untangling corporate disputes before they became expensive mistakes. She reminded the group, calmly but firmly, that accusing anyone of sabotage required actual evidence, not panic dressed up as certainty, and that Sterling Arrow could not afford to make a public accusation it might later regret. Mason reached into his jacket and produced a folded printout, a written technical note he had submitted 2 days earlier flagging the exact thermal synchronization concern now causing the shutdown. Evelyn read it carefully, her eyebrows lifting slightly as she recognized the timestamp, then turned toward Logan with a question that made the color drain slightly from his face. Charlotte took the printout from Evelyn's hands and scanned it herself, her stomach tightening as she realized the warning had existed long before the failure occurred, buried somewhere it clearly never should have been. She turned toward Logan, demanding to know why this report had never reached her desk, and Logan stammered through an explanation about the warning seeming minor, insisting it had not seemed serious enough to justify delaying an event this important. Wyatt, standing nearby, kept his eyes fixed on the ground, caught between loyalty to his job and the growing discomfort of watching an innocent man take blame for a danger he had personally tried to prevent. Charlotte's certainty began to crack at the edges, doubt creeping into an expression that had spent the entire morning radiating control. Still, pride kept her from offering anything close to an apology, and she simply ordered the investigation to continue while privately wondering for the first time whether she had misjudged the man standing in front of her. The investors waiting near the lounge were growing visibly restless, glancing at their phones, exchanging quiet remarks about delays they had not budgeted into their morning, and Charlotte understood that every additional minute without an explanation chipped away at whatever confidence remained in the room. She excused herself briefly to address them with a vague reassurance, buying time she desperately needed, all while the unresolved tension surrounding Mason continued to simmer just out of sight. Wyatt finally found the courage to pull Charlotte aside, away from the gathering crowd of executives and anxious investors, his voice low enough that only she could hear what he was about to reveal. He told her that Mason was not simply a freelance repairman picking up odd jobs around the airfield, but a man who had once worked deep inside a classified jet engine testing program, the kind of work most people never learned existed because it stayed buried under layers of confidentiality agreements. Mason had designed a safety verification process during that time, Wyatt explained, one that had prevented several catastrophic failures before quietly disappearing from public record after an internal dispute drove him out of the industry entirely. The dispute, as Wyatt understood it, had involved a senior executive who claimed credit for work Mason had quietly completed alone, And rather than fight a battle he had little power to win, Mason had simply walked away, choosing his daughter and his peace of mind over a career built on proving a point to people who had already decided not to listen. Since then, Mason had taken whatever repair work he could find, never advertising his background, never correcting the assumptions people made when they saw his worn jacket and modest truck parked outside the hangar. Charlotte listened with growing disbelief, unwilling to accept that someone she had dismissed so casually that morning might possess expertise far beyond anyone currently on her payroll. She demanded proof, unwilling to base her next move on a story that sounded more like rumor than fact. And Evelyn immediately began searching through archived industry records using credentials she still maintained from her years in aviation law. After several tense minutes paging through old filings, Evelyn found exactly what she was looking for: a technical patent buried under the name of a company that had long since dissolved, listing Mason Carter as the original engineer behind a safety mechanism that had quietly become standard across the industry. Charlotte stared at the screen, her mind working quickly as she recognized fragments of that very mechanism embedded somewhere inside the design of the jet currently sitting silent and useless behind her. The realization landed with uncomfortable weight, the understanding that the foundation supporting her $200 million machine had been shaped, at least in part, by the same man she had humiliated in front of a crowd less than an hour earlier. Mason, when informed that his background had surfaced, showed no flicker of vindication or pride. He simply repeated what he had said from the beginning, that he wanted to be paid the $599 he was owed and allowed to return home before his daughter finished her school day. There was no performance in his composure, no calculated attempt to leverage his past into greater advantage, only the steady patience of a man who had long ago stopped expecting recognition from people who judged him by his appearance rather than his ability. Charlotte found his restraint more unsettling than anger would have been, because anger she understood, while quiet dignity left her with nothing to push against. For the first time that morning, she felt the uncomfortable sensation of standing in front of someone whose worth she had badly miscalculated, and the shame of it settled into her chest long before she was ready to admit it out loud. By mid-morning, footage of Charlotte hurling the crumpled receipt at Mason's chest had already spread through private messaging threads among the very investors she had hoped to impress, the kind of clip that traveled faster than any official statement could contain. Several guests, sensing the launch had collapsed into something closer to scandal, quietly informed her assistants that they intended to delay any commitment to the new contract until the cause of the malfunction became clear. Reporters who had arrived expecting a celebratory headline began drafting very different stories instead, ones built around an aircraft that refused to start and a chief executive who had publicly insulted the man now rumored to have prevented a disaster. Logan, sensing the walls tightening around his own role in the unfolding crisis, suggested privately to Charlotte that the simplest path forward was to publicly blame Mason entirely, framing him as a disgruntled contractor whose recklessness had nearly ruined the event. Evelyn rejected the idea immediately, warning that fabricating blame against a man with documented expertise and a written warning on record could expose the company to far greater legal danger than the embarrassment they currently faced. Charlotte stood between the two competing instincts, one urging her to protect her pride at any cost, the other quietly reminding her that the truth, however uncomfortable, was the only path that did not eventually destroy her credibility entirely. In the middle of the tension, Mason stepped briefly away to take a call near the hangar's outer wall, his voice softening the moment he heard his daughter's name mentioned by the babysitter on the other end of the line. He spoke only a few sentences, asking simple questions about homework and dinner, his tone carrying none of the urgency that filled the air around him, only the quiet steadiness of a father managing two separate worlds at once. Charlotte, standing closer than she realized, overheard enough of the conversation to understand something she had not considered all morning, that the man she had dismissed as unworthy of a modest invoice was carrying responsibilities heavier than anything reflected in his appearance. The realization shifted something in her, not guilt exactly, but the early discomfort of recognizing a person where she had previously seen only an inconvenience. She approached him afterward and offered, almost too quickly, to pay him 10 times what he was originally owed if he agreed to fix the aircraft immediately and keep the entire incident contained. Mason studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression neither offended nor impressed by the sudden generosity now being offered. He told her plainly that money had stopped being the central issue the moment she decided his worth could be measured by a number scrawled on a piece of paper. What he wanted now was simpler and far more difficult for someone like her to give freely, an acknowledgement that the failure sitting silent in the hangar had nothing to do with sabotage, and everything to do with people choosing convenience over truth long before he ever arrived that morning. Charlotte opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, recognizing for the first time that every instinct guiding her that morning had been built around protecting her image rather than understanding what had actually gone wrong. The silence between them stretched longer than either expected, filled not with hostility but with the slow, uncomfortable work of a woman reconsidering assumptions she had carried for most of her adult life. Mason finally agreed to examine the aircraft properly, but only after laying out 3 conditions he expected Charlotte to honor without negotiation. First, she would need to publicly withdraw any suggestion that he had sabotaged the jet, removing the accusation entirely from whatever statement her company eventually released. Second, Logan would be required to surrender every maintenance record he had quietly buried or altered over the past several months, including the warning Mason had submitted days earlier. Third, the technical staff working beneath Logan would need to be granted the freedom to report problems honestly without fear of punishment or dismissal, a condition that struck directly at the culture Charlotte had allowed to take root inside her own company. Charlotte bristled instinctively at being handed terms by a man she had humiliated only hours earlier, the old instinct toward control rising sharply in her chest. Evelyn, sensing the danger of pride overtaking judgment again, quietly reminded her that refusing these conditions now would not only risk the aircraft but risk the entire company's reputation should the truth surface later through less forgiving means. Logan, growing visibly uneasy, attempted to interrupt the conversation twice, each time steering attention away from the records Mason had specifically requested. His sudden eagerness to change the subject did not escape Evelyn's notice, and she made a quiet mental note to examine his recent activity more closely once the immediate crisis allowed her the time to do so properly. Charlotte finally agreed, more out of necessity than humility, and authorized Mason to access the technical bay alongside Wyatt and 2 other engineers who had remained quiet throughout the morning's chaos. Inside the bay, Mason moved methodically, tracing wiring harnesses and pressure lines with the unhurried focus of someone who had performed this kind of diagnostic work long before most of the people watching him had entered the industry. Within minutes, he identified that the failure was not isolated to a single faulty part, but stemmed from a broader pattern of cost-driven substitutions made during the final stages of assembly. Several components originally specified for the thermal regulation system had been quietly replaced with cheaper alternatives, a decision clearly made to protect profit margins rather than performance standards. Mason recognized immediately that this was not simple negligence, but a deliberate effort to cut costs while avoiding the kind of scrutiny that proper testing would have triggered. He explained to Wyatt, in a low voice meant to avoid drawing Logan's attention, that whoever approved these substitutions had likely understood the risk involved and chosen to bury it rather than delay the launch. Wyatt's expression tightened with the particular discomfort of a man realizing his own silence had played a quiet role in allowing the decision to stand unchallenged. Mason did not say it aloud, but the pattern in front of him told a clear story, one where ambition and convenience had been allowed to override the basic responsibility of keeping people safe. The deeper he looked, the more obvious it became that the danger sitting inside that hangar had been building for weeks, long before anyone handed him a $599 invoice for a problem far smaller than the one now unraveling in front of everyone. Mason gathered Charlotte, Evelyn, and Wyatt near a diagnostic display and walked them through the failure in language simple enough for anyone in the room to understand, regardless of their technical background. He explained that the thermal synchronization unit, the component responsible for regulated air pressure between the engine's core systems, had been replaced with a version that did not meet the precision standards required for an aircraft of this size and power. Because the mismatch existed, the engine's internal safeguards had detected the imbalance and forced a shutdown rather than allow ignition to continue under unsafe conditions. In simple terms, the very failure that had embarrassed Charlotte in front of her most important guests was not a malfunction at all, but a built-in safety response designed specifically to prevent something far worse from happening in the air. Had the substituted component gone unnoticed and the jet successfully taken flight, the The same imbalance could have triggered a catastrophic failure thousands of feet above the ground, with no opportunity for correction once the aircraft left the runway. Charlotte's face drained of color as the full weight of what Mason was describing settled over her. The understanding that the disaster she had been desperate to avoid that morning was nothing compared to the disaster narrowly prevented by the very shutdown she had been furious about. Wyatt, unable to stay silent any longer, admitted that he had flagged concerns about the substituted parts weeks earlier, only to be told by Logan that revising the documentation to reflect specifications would be simpler than delaying the schedule to address the issue properly. Evelyn moved quickly, pulling internal records, approval signatures, and procurement invoices that traced the decision directly back to choices Logan had made under pressure to protect quarterly performance numbers. The evidence painted an unmistakable picture of a man who had prioritized appearances and profit margins over the basic safety of the people who would eventually fly on this aircraft. Charlotte stood quietly as the layers peeled back in front of her, recognizing with growing discomfort that an environment she herself had cultivated, one built on fear, image, and relentless pressure to deliver results, had created the exact conditions that allowed Logan's decision to go unchallenged for so long. Her employees had learned, long before this morning, that raising uncomfortable truths carried more personal risk than staying quiet ever would. Mason did not lecture her, did not use the moment to humiliate her the way she had humiliated him hours earlier. He simply observed, in a tone that carried no judgment, that machines almost always send warnings before they fail completely, and that people tend to behave the very same way long before they finally break under the weight of being ignored. Charlotte absorbed the remark slowly, feeling its weight settle somewhere deeper than the immediate crisis surrounding the jet, recognizing the truth in it extending far beyond engines and pressure systems. For the first time since the morning began, she looked at Mason not as an inconvenience standing between her and a successful launch, but as someone whose steady, unglamorous expertise had quietly protected lives that morning while she had been preoccupied with appearances. The shift in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, the slow dismantling of an assumption she had carried for years about whose contributions deserved respect and whose did not. She thought briefly of every technician, every mechanic, every quiet worker she had walked past without a second glance over the course of building her company, wondering how many of them had carried the same kind of overlooked competence that had just saved her from disaster. With the truth finally exposed, Mason rolled up his sleeves and began the work of correcting what weeks of quiet shortcuts had broken, fully aware that the investors waiting outside had given Charlotte only a narrow window of time to prove the aircraft could be trusted again. The pressure inside the hangar grew thick and immediate, every minute carrying the weight of a contract worth more money than most of the people present would see in their lifetimes. Wyatt worked alongside him without hesitation now, his earlier silence replaced by a determined focus to make right what he had allowed to slide for far too long. Two younger engineers joined as well, watching Mason's hands move with the practiced confidence of someone who had performed similar repairs in far higher stakes environments than a corporate hangar. The room fell into the particular stillness found in operating theaters, where conversation narrows down to only what matters, and everyone present understands that mistakes carry consequences too serious to risk for the sake of comfortable silence. Charlotte stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching closely, no longer issuing instructions or demanding updates the way she had done all morning. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she simply listened. Somewhere outside she could hear the restless murmur of investors waiting near the lounge, a sound that would have once filled her with urgency to perform. But in that moment it barely registered against the quiet concentration filling the hangar. Mason worked through the housing with methodical patience, comparing the substituted thermal unit against the original specifications Wyatt had pulled up on a tablet beside him. Rather than waiting for a replacement part that would take hours to source, Mason proposed a manual recalibration technique, one that relied less on expensive equipment and more on decades of hands-on understanding most modern engineers rarely developed anymore. He adjusted the pressure thresholds carefully, cross-checking each adjustment against the engine's internal safety margins to ensure the correction would not simply mask the imbalance but genuinely resolve it. Logan attempted, in the chaos of the moment, to quietly delete several files connected to the original procurement decision from a nearby terminal, hoping the crisis would distract everyone long enough for the evidence to vanish. Evelyn, who had not let her attention drift from him since the conversation in the technical bay, caught his movement immediately and blocked access before any files could be erased, her expression making clear that his attempt had only deepened the trouble waiting for him. As the recalibration neared completion, the team prepared for another ignition attempt, tension rising sharply among everyone gathered near the cockpit. The engine sputtered weakly on the first try, a brief flicker of power followed by silence that sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the hangar. Mason remained calm, tracing the readout once more, and identified a secondary sensor that had also drifted out of calibration during the same round of cost-driven substitutions weeks earlier. He adjusted it carefully, checked the connections twice, then asked everyone to step back before signaling the pilot to attempt ignition again. The engine roared to life this time, steady and powerful, filling the hangar with a sound that felt less like machinery and more like relief given form. The technical team erupted into quiet celebration, exhausted smiles breaking across faces that had spent the entire morning braced for disaster. Charlotte stood frozen for a long moment, watching the jet she had nearly destroyed through her own arrogance now humming with the confident rhythm of an aircraft finally repaired the right way by the one person she had been so quick to dismiss. Charlotte walked back out to the waiting crowd of investors and reporters with none of the polished confidence she had carried that morning, replaced instead by the careful seriousness of someone preparing to say something she could not take back once spoken. She did not attempt to spin the morning's events into something more flattering than the truth deserved. Standing in front of cameras she had once hoped would capture a triumphant launch, she admitted plainly that she had insulted a man based entirely on his appearance, dismissing his expertise without ever asking what he had actually repaired or why it mattered. She explained, without flinching, that the $599 invoice she had mocked represented hours of precise work that had ultimately prevented a catastrophic failure, one that could have cost lives had it gone unnoticed. The number itself, she admitted, had never been the point. It had only ever measured the size of her own misjudgment, not the value of the man standing behind it. Several reporters exchanged glances, recognizing that the story they were about to write had shifted entirely from scandal toward something closer to accountability. Logan was suspended before the afternoon ended, his role in approving the substituted components and burying the resulting warnings handed over to an internal review that left little room for him to talk his way out of consequences this time. Wyatt, along with the rest of the technical staff who had spent months afraid to speak honestly about safety concerns, were formally granted direct reporting access to leadership, removing the layer of fear that had allowed Logan's decisions to go unchallenged for so long. Mason accepted none of this with triumph. When Charlotte returned the crumpled receipt to him, smoothed out as best she could manage, he simply folded it and placed it back into his jacket pocket without a word. Charlotte personally authorized the payment of $599, attaching a written apology she had drafted herself rather than leaving it to an assistant, an acknowledgement that some debts could not be settled through money alone. Mason read it briefly, then looked up at her with an expression that held no satisfaction in her embarrassment, only the quiet steadiness that had defined him since the moment he first walked through the gate that morning. He told her plainly that he did not need her admiration, nor did he expect the kind of gratitude that often faded once the immediate crisis passed. What he asked instead was simpler and harder to forget, that she remember, long after this morning became a story people told rather than a moment they lived through, that the people who kept aircraft from falling out of the sky rarely looked the way she had expected them to look. Charlotte absorbed the words slowly, recognizing in them a lesson far more valuable than anything written into the contracts she had spent the morning trying to protect. She extended her hand toward him, not as a gesture for cameras or witnesses, but as something quieter and more honest, an acknowledgement between two people who had started the day as strangers divided by assumption and ended it with something closer to mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Aero quietly rebuilt its internal safety procedures from the foundation upward, replacing the culture of fear Logan had thrived under with one that rewarded honesty over convenience. Charlotte mandated independent technical reviews for every aircraft nearing completion, a policy she had never seriously considered before the morning her own arrogance had nearly cost the company everything. She approached Mason personally with an offer to join the company as lead independent safety consultant, a position designed specifically around the kind of expertise most executives never thought to value until disaster forced them to. Mason hesitated, unwilling to step back into an industry that had once pushed him out through politics rather than performance, the memory of that earlier betrayal still sitting somewhere beneath his calm exterior. He had built a quiet, modest life around repair work precisely because it asked nothing of him beyond honest labor, free from the ambition and image-driven pressure that had once cost him so much. Evelyn, sensing his hesitation, brought him a final piece of information she had uncovered while reviewing old industry records, one she believed he deserved to see regardless of whatever decision he ultimately made. The original patent listing his name as the engineer behind the safety mechanism still embedded in modern aircraft design had been quietly absorbed by his former. Years earlier, the credit and resulting financial benefits stripped from him through legal language he had never fully understood at the time. Charlotte, upon learning this, did not see it as leverage to convince him, but as a debt the entire industry owed him long before she ever insulted him over a $599 invoice. She offered him a new contract instead, one that restored proper recognition for his original work, granted him independent authority over safety decisions without interference from leadership, and compensated him fairly for expertise she now understood had no reasonable price attached to it. Mason considered the offer carefully, thinking less about himself and more about the stability it could finally offer the life he had built around raising his daughter alone. He kept a small photograph tucked inside his wallet, a simple image of his daughter laughing during an ordinary afternoon, the kind of memory that had quietly anchored every difficult decision he had made since becoming a single father. He had never shown it to anyone that day, never used it to soften the way people treated him or to justify the choices he made. Charlotte caught a brief glimpse of it once, during a quiet moment between meetings, and understood instantly that nothing about Mason's resilience that morning had been about pride or vindication. It had only ever been about protecting the people who depended on him, both in the sky and at home. The final test flight took place on a clear afternoon weeks later, the same jet that had once sat silent and humiliated now lifting smoothly into the sky under engines Mason had personally verified down to the smallest detail. Charlotte stood beside him on the tarmac, watching the aircraft climb steadily upward, no trace remaining of the arrogance that had defined her only weeks earlier. She admitted quietly, almost to herself, that she had once believed he was not worth $599. Mason watched the jet disappear into the clouds before answering, his voice calm and unhurried as it had been from the very beginning. He told her that a person's value was never measured by what appeared on an invoice, but by what they quietly prevented the world from losing. As the aircraft vanished from sight, Mason picked up his toolbox and turned to leave, asking for no applause, no recognition beyond what had already been freely given. He had never needed loud vindication to know his own worth. The truth, as it always had, simply spoke for itself, steady and unshaken, long after the noise of that morning had finally settled into silence.